Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for coming. I hope I can help wake you from your post-lunch torpor. I've been with Ignition Partners for about 15 months now. I joined when they raised Fund 5. Before that, I was employee number 10 and worked for 13 years at an industry analysis company called 451 Research. We named it after the temperature at which paper burns. Unfortunately, Ray Bradbury never noticed because he was kind of notoriously litigious, so if he'd known that we did that, he might have sued us. But he didn't. And when we started 451, Gartner and Forrester were huge research companies, obviously, and we needed to do something that would distinguish ourselves from our giant competitors. And so we looked at emerging technology, and we studied new trends and new software that was coming out of startup companies, and we covered that much more extensively than traditional IT industry analysis firms had done. We actually launched 451 15 years ago today. We launched it on the 1st of April in 2000. And the dot-com bust promptly took place and crashed, and all of our potential customers evaporated. So we had a very exciting few months, years, of wandering through the wilderness. And all of our early customers were venture capital firms who were as interested as we were in looking across the startup ecosystem. The upshot was that I got to spend 13 years talking to startup entrepreneurs, learning about emerging startups, emerging technology, selling the research to venture capital firms, and I got myself into the mindset of a venture capitalist convincingly enough that eventually one of them hired me. And that's the long story of how I got to Ignition Partners and why I'm here today, because obviously one of the huge things that happened between 2000 and now is the rise of DevOps and of all of the enabling technologies that made it possible. The short answer to how I became a VC, and the one I usually give people, is that I'm a failed English professor. I got both of my degrees in English literature. And if you graduate in English literature and don't go into academia, you end up having an extremely interesting and unexpected life. So my talk today is going to resemble a good, I hope, English literature lecture, in that I'm going to do a literature review. I'm going to look across the state of the art in how enterprises are using DevOps today. Then I'm going to try and place those case studies in their historical context. I was lucky enough to be very close to the birth of DevOps and to watch some of the early philosophies and companies coming together. And I'm going to finish up with some thoughts about where we go from here and what lies in the future and what the long-term implications of the DevOps movement might be. My case studies are drawn from Ignition's CIO Council. It turns out that when one of your general partners used to be the CIO of Microsoft, and all of the CIOs in North America used to call him for advice and ask him how he was doing things at Microsoft, it's very easy to recruit Fortune 500 companies to your CIO Council. So that made my job very easy. We work very closely with Accenture, Disney, GE, Morgan, Stanley, Nike, and some others. But these are the members of our council who have actually published interesting work around their deployment of DevOps. In fact, Disney's case study is so interesting that it's taking place next door. So I have a very brief summary of their story here, but if you want to know more, come back and watch the video of what you missed. When I talk about how we got here, I'm going to go back and look at some possibly slightly unexpected proof points, not so much around technology, and we'll talk more about that when I get there. And when I talk about where we go from here, in the last 15 months, I've been trying to spin up all of the stuff that I missed while I was a technology analyst and reinforce that with a bunch of cultural literacy around the business side. So I've been reading very intensely. And I want to pick out four, actually there's five, there's a secret bonus book at the end. Books which have helped me form my thinking about not only DevOps, but the larger movements in which it plays a crucial thread. When I pitched this talk, I talked about DevOps going mainstream. As I researched it, I came to the embarrassing realization that mainstream has actually gone DevOps. When I looked at the Global 500, I found more examples of them being enmeshed in DevOps than not. The enterprise is already on it. But in many cases, it may not be a DevOps that the Web 2.0 world would recognize as such. It's not, in many cases, primarily an adoption of technical tools. And in some cases, it's something quite different from that. Let's have a look at some specific examples. Frank Modrison, the former CIO of Accenture, is a member of our CIO Council. And Noel Heredia, who used to report to him but is now at PwC, headed up what they called their DevOps practice. And the reason that Accenture had a DevOps practice was that they found a number of the large clients that they worked with were spending at least 85% of their IT budget just keeping the lights on. It wasn't about innovation. It wasn't about creating new revenue or new services for their company. It was just about keeping the existing kit patched together with spit and duct tape. There was very little, if any, money left over for innovation, for improvement, and the potential for building new applications was strictly constrained by the availability of only 15% of the budget. And in one particular case, Noel Heredia found that a customer was losing $15 million a year to defects that were discovered in production because they'd been missed in the test and QA cycles before the software was released. So as Noel developed the practice, he started to ask 3 questions of the clients with whom he was working. And the first one was about responsibility and accountability. Who owns the problem? The second was about whether employees trusted the organization to make enormous changes. Because when employees are confronted with the fact that existing processes are dropping money on the floor, are dropping opportunities on the floor, that existing processes are costing enormous amounts of money just to keep everything as they are and not generate any new revenue for the company, the first thing they think is, I'm going to get fired. And the second thing they think is that my servers or my responsibilities are going to get taken away from me. You can't make any kind of organizational change along the lines of DevOps without arriving in a relationship of trust where the employee believes that they'll continue to have a future within the organization even when these huge changes are made. The third question Noel would ask would be, do you have the right technology? And the point here is that the technology choice issues post-dated, often by months, the organizational and trust issues that Noel had to address. So Disney's going on next door. If you listen hard, you might be able to hear a much expanded version of this slide. Jason Cox is actually speaking. Disney's obviously an amazing company, a huge company, primarily media company. But like all of the enterprises I'm talking about here, it's shifting from being a physical product company to a virtual product company. It's undergoing a transformation from manipulating atoms to manipulating bits. And as Disney undergoes this enormous transformation, each of the business segments pushes for greater speed and stability in their ability to deliver those bits. They want the speed and the stability at the same time. The stability is part of Disney's guest experience. It's a key part of their brand as the big, safe, family-friendly company. And so the pressure on Jason Cox at the head of the web operations team is enormous. And yet one of the first things he did was change the name of the team from web operations to systems engineering. And you might think that that was a superficial change, but as an English professor in another life, I am here to tell you that language is incredibly important. And what happened when the name of this team changed to systems engineering was that the applications engineers started to see them as kindred spirits. They started to see them as fellow engineers who were on the same side. The software engineers who were creating products and the systems engineers who were delivering products were now explicitly on the same team, working towards the same goals. The next thing that happened was the systems engineers were embedded, like reporters in Iraq, into the product-focused groups alongside software engineering, alongside QA and test. It became impossible for the systems engineers to distance themselves from the challenges that the product groups were facing. And it was only after those 2 changes had taken place, and you'll notice that those 2 changes involved responsibility and trust. Systems engineering taking responsibility for fulfilling what engineering was trying to do, and embedded engineers becoming parts of product groups. It was only after those responsibility and trust steps had been taken that the systems engineers started to promote the kinds of automation tools we're talking about here: version control, continuous integration, continuous delivery and monitoring. And my favorite quote from Jason Cox is that these tools change the human experience. They change how we think. The question goes from how do we scale to how do we think about the infrastructure as code? Not from web operations to, now that we're systems engineers, how do we think ourselves into the mindsets of the software engineers so that we're all using the same tools to solve the same set of problems? Configuration management is code for automation, and infrastructure is code for product delivery. And it's when you make those fundamental transformations to your thinking that the tools actually become useful. Until you've changed your thinking, the tools can be extraneous or even harmful. And what they eventually found, of course, was that DevOps at Disney matched the collaborative style and culture of the company, which made it a little easier to do at Disney than it is to do at certain other companies. GE is just a phenomenal company. It's actually a global 10 company. It's the only firm that was listed in the original Dow Jones Industrial Index that's still listed. And Alan Shotley, who leads the Software Solutions Group, has said that GE will never be a software company. It will always be an industrial company. Alone among the companies I'm describing here, this one will never shift entirely to manipulating only bits. It's always going to be a company that manipulates atoms. However, to succeed in the future of industry, which is the future of the industrial internet, GE has to solve a lot of problems that are only soluble with software. It's going to have to capture the data that flows out of its products in the fields, principally enormous turbines that turn inside power plants. The problems that GE is trying to solve around its turbines are how to improve design, how to secure the data streams from the power plants back to the cloud services, and then how to embrace Agile and CI and CD. And that's why it's making investments in software, most recently a $100 million investment in Pivotal. But it's also investing in significant and substantial cultural change internally. It took 70 teams, 800 engineers, and combined them to form the group that Alan Shotley heads up. And those 70 teams are responsible for energy management, distributed management, and outage management software, plus the smart grid. And at first, that glomming of all of those groups together went extremely badly. They were still pursuing waterfall-style processes for their software development. And it was in the spirit of a Hail Mary pass that GE went all in on Agile. And my favorite quote from Alan is, the bottom line is that they were spending a ton of money on talent, so we needed to get them the best infrastructure that could be built. And that ultimately was GE's rationale for embracing DevOps. So the tools came after. It began with the cultural change and then moved towards Scrum teams, Agile coaches, frameworks. Today, GE's SSG can produce working software every 2 weeks. It was 6 months before they went through this transformation. And the journey has only really started because that's 800 out of 15,000 engineers. And so the next job is to bring DevOps to the other 14,000. This is actually the oldest of the case studies. Ben Fried, who became the CIO of Google in 2011, after he left Morgan Stanley, with the joy and security of being on Google's tenure track, could be unusually candid about his former employer and what had gone wrong there. And what Ben had worked on at Morgan Stanley was a huge trading application that extended the capabilities of Morgan Stanley's web trading application to customers' desktops. And they basically designed the infrastructure as badly as they could possibly have done in retrospect. They encouraged the customers to purchase leased lines, and then they ran all of those leased lines through Morgan Stanley's public internet. They bought a very large bandwidth link and stuck a load balancer in front of it, which had far lower capacity than the very high bandwidth pipe itself. In general, Ben says, what had happened was that every team had scaled up its own function without thinking about the implications of that scaling on every other siloed function within the scope of that application. Without even thinking about it, Ben says, we scaled up through specialization. And Ben took all of the lessons he'd learned from the failure of that application to Google, where he tried to do everything differently. But he left behind an IT organization that also learned lessons from that. And today, the bank understands that DevOps is a cultural change, that it requires scaling up through generalization and not through specialization. And the bank is pretty open about the fact that in the fast-moving environment of trading, it really has no choice except to embrace the fastest way of delivering and shipping code that it can possibly lay its hands on. It's also harnessing a lot more analytics and development. And finally, there's Nike. Jason Roby actually walked into a situation not unlike the one Ben Fried walked out of at Morgan Stanley. He's described it as a code red scenario. And this was a situation in which Nike's production environment was barely stable. At first, Nike tried to address the situation by moving to a very deep vertical stack using expensive proprietary technology. But in Jason's own words, all that they'd done was build a monolith. And given the enormous importance of digital services to Nike's brand, this was an untenable situation. Like Ben, Jason found that scaling concerns were not crossing functional boundaries. So one of the things that he had to do was encourage people to think beyond their specific functional specialization and to understand the implications of each scaling decision across the entire scope of the application. And he managed to get this done, and stability started to improve, but the dev cycle was still too long. So, like GE, Nike ended up embracing many of the tenets of agile development and production, including shared nothing Amazon AMIs, importing huge chunks of the Netflix open source software and continuous delivery. And finally, Jason got it to the point where new features can be delivered in days rather than weeks. And Nike is actually a really great example of the kind of large manufacturing organization that's now primarily selling a brand, again, moving more from atoms to bits, and that actually functions in practice as a set of digital agencies internally. So the digital side of Nike's business is enormous. And it's really an exemplar of what Gartner is talking about when it says CMOs now have larger IT budgets than CIOs typically. So that's what's happening across the Global 500. You're seeing these enormous legacy monolithic organizations in crisis. They're facing furious disruptive competition from young upstarts. They're shifting their businesses radically from traditional industrial and service organizations to becoming software delivery organizations. And they're finding it's completely impossible to do that without really profound cultural changes underpinning the technology. So how did we get here? How did we get into this situation where that cultural change that they're describing is being described in terms that came out of the DevOps movement? You're probably as familiar with the history of DevOps as I am, and so I'll skip through this section. I trace the origin of the DevOps movement to a talk given at Velocity 2009, which was called 10 deploys per day. It was hugely influential, not only in the sense that it really kicked off this conversation, but also in the sense that it made John Olspoor and Paul Hammond's careers. John Olspoor is now obviously running Etsy. Paul Hammond went on to Slack. And what's really interesting about that, to me, is that Flickr exemplifies what happens when an organization itself is agile, when it's capable of pivoting. Flickr started out as a games company called Ludicorp. which created an immersive online game called Game Never Ending. If you look at Flickr file extensions to this day, they use the .gne postfix suffix, which stands for Game Never Ending. And Paul, as I said, went on to Slack. Slack was originally a games company called TinySpec, which created an immersive online game called Glitch, which was basically the second coming of Game Never Ending. And, of course, Glitch itself has pivoted to become the maker of Slack, which is the second coming of IRC. And I bring that up because these are the 10 original points that John and Paul tried to make in that talk. And you'll see that IRC was present right from the beginning of DevOps. That kind of team communication in real time is essential, and it's a critical part of DevOps' original DNA. And you'll see that 6 of these features that were outlined in that first talk are technical, automated infrastructure, shared version control. 4 of them are cultural. And it's my contention that these cultural aspects of DevOps will, in the long term, prove to be more enduring and more influential even than the technology. And that's a big concession coming from me because, of course, Ignition is one of the investors in Chef, and Chef makes the tools, and we would all like the tools to make a lot of money. But in fact, I think the long-term significance of DevOps, of this talk, and of the movement of which we're all a part, are the cultural issues. You can't pivot from Ludacorp to Flickr or from TinySpec to Slack without these 4 fundamental attributes. Unless your employees respect and trust you, believe that you'll take responsibility for these changes, unless your employees believe that they can make experiments, they can try to achieve product market fit and fail and not be blamed for it, then you can't pivot. And if you as an organization can't pivot and you're facing competitive disruptions from companies that can, good luck. This is the point at which I depart from talking about technology altogether and start to talk about some of the cultural documents that have come up in the years since the Velocity 2009 talk. Zappos is obviously a company that delivers shoes, but is another company that is fundamentally investing its value add to its customers in software and customer service and not in the shoes themselves. The shoes are manufactured elsewhere. Zappos is a delivery organization. In a sense, it's DevOps writ large in that it's designed entirely to create software facilitation of the delivery of products. And Tony Hsieh attributes Zappos' success to its core values, which are deliver wow through service, embrace and drive change, create fun and a little weirdness, be adventurous, creative and open-minded, pursue growth and learning, build honest and open relationships, build a positive team and family spirit, do more with less, be passionate and determined, and be humble. And of these, I would say 50%, 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 for the record, are straight out of the Flickr Agile DevOps playbook. The others, create fun and a little weirdness, build a positive team and family spirit, actually start to skirt around the edge of cultishness. And you might have seen reports recently that Zappos is going all in on holacracy and is offering severance to any employees who are not similarly willing to go all in. We'll return to that in a little bit. Valve is another company that competes and claims to outcompete on the strength of its culture. The Valve Employee Handbook, if you haven't read it, is well worth a read. It definitely comes to us from a parallel universe in which people are more enlightened and intelligent. It includes such sections as why do I need to pick my own projects? How do I decide which things to work on? How do I find out what projects are underway? What if I screw up? What if we all screw up? And from the tenor of those questions, you can probably gather that the organizational hierarchy of Valve, a game company up in Seattle, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is extremely flat. And basically, you're expected to show up at work, find out for yourself what's going on, what's really important, where you can add value, and work on that. Valve introduces the term T-shaped people. What it's looking to recruit are people who are both broad and deep, who have general skills across a broad range and who have one particular area of specialization in which they're deeper than other people. And I think that's a really interesting trade-off between the kinds of specialization that led to scaling problems that we were talking about earlier and the impossibility in environments as complex as the ones we're talking about for everyone to be an expert in everything. To be a T-shaped person is to have broad general skills that are maybe a little shallow and to have one thing that you can do better than anyone else. And that's another concept that we'll return to in a little bit. Netflix is yet another company that's competing on the strength of its culture. It has, like Zappos, a list of what its core cultures are, and they are values of what we value, high performance, freedom and responsibility, context not control, highly aligned, loosely coupled, paid top of market, and promotions and development. And now, of course, we're getting quite far afield from Flickr and from pure DevOps. But I think you can see the family relationship between Netflix and Zappos, and especially between Netflix and Valve. These cultures obviously aren't going to work for all kinds of people, which is why Zappos is paying people out. But for the people for whom they do work, the bet is that they can make those people enormously more productive. And Netflix's culture is innovative enough that it earned itself a front-page story in the Harvard Business Review. Because what we're talking about is an HR question, but in fact, it's even deeper than that. What companies are now competing for in this environment where they're manipulating bits instead of atoms is the people who are capable of manipulating bits better than anyone else. And what companies are doing is scrambling to build the best possible environments in which those people can be happy and productive. My contention is that DevOps and Agile are at their heart methods for enabling very fast and efficient knowledge work. And at this point, I want to give it up for the original gangsters, Toyota, who have been doing this under other names for, I guess, 50 years now. The central tenets of the Toyota production system, which is also known as just-in-time manufacturing or lean manufacturing, should sound very familiar by now, because they are continuous improvement, respect for people, long-term philosophy, the right process will drive the right results, add value to your organization by developing your people and partners, and continuously solving root problems drives organizational learning. So the adoption of DevOps by enterprise was actually part of a much larger cultural movement, inspired in part by Toyota and other management philosophies of the late 20th century. DevOps was a set of technical innovations married to a set of cultural innovations that fell on very fertile ground, because enterprises had been struggling with these issues of global competitiveness for decades. So what's next? I wish I knew. If I did know, I would invest in it. I'm hoping to find out. And to that end, I've been doing a ton of reading. I would say that The Everything Store is not a good book, but it's about a subject of sufficiently compelling interest that I've included it here. Jeff Bezos is a really staggeringly original thinker around all of this. He was originally a quant, of course, at one of the exotic trading firms on Wall Street. And he had the idea for an everything store before he had the idea of delivering books. Books were just a placeholder. Jeff's hedgehog idea, a concept that we'll get back to, was of an everything store, hence the title of the book. And what he wanted to deliver was low prices, limitless selection, and convenience. And this was reflected in a shift that Brad Stone goes into quite deeply and in some very interesting passages in this book, in which the warehouses where Amazon kept its inventory and sent it out to customers gradually metamorphosed from distribution centers to what are now called fulfillment centers, and stopped being very large and in the center of the country and started to move closer to the customers, just-in-time delivery, if you will. And what Amazon started to find was that there was a virtuous circle happening. Lower prices led to more customer visits, more customers increased the volume of sales and attracted more commission-paying third parties to the site. That allowed Amazon to get more out of its fixed costs, like the fulfillment centers and the servers needed to run the website. And that leads to greater efficiency, and that means Amazon can drop its prices. It all came out of a corporate culture of relentless ambition. There are no perks at Amazon, not even Advil. People use those famous door desks. And the implications of this, I think, are fascinating as Amazon continues to subsidize AWS effectively, this incredibly competitive, very ambitious company, throwing a lot of money into building an empire. It really is a relic of the dot-com era. It really is losing $10 on every sale, but believing that it will make up in volume. It's a paragon of very, very long-term thinking. Jeff Bezos is fascinating because he thinks in terms of 40 or 50-year cycles in the business. Tony Hsieh, who I've mentioned before, makes a really interesting contrast. In his book, which is obviously not ghostwritten and is uncomfortably candid at points, he talks about after making money in the dot-com era himself, he spent a lot of it going to raves, where he became enamored of rave culture's culture of plur, peace, love, understanding, and respect. One of the other things that he spent his money on was a bunch of condos in 1000 Van Ness in San Francisco, which became a bunch of party lofts. He had a bunch of his friends moved in, and it was basically a dot-com frat house. There was a restaurant downstairs run by Hsieh's parents called Venture Frogs, and all of the dishes were named after dot-com companies like Akamai. Not very surprisingly, the restaurant failed, and the incubator of the same name, Venture Frogs, had one very successful outcome, and that outcome was Zappos, and Tony Hsieh moved to become its CEO, and moved the entire company to Las Vegas, where he seems to be trying to rebuild that frat house culture on a metropolitan scale. And as I mentioned, the latest experiment is holacracy, and they're paying anyone who isn't totally bought in to leave. And this is one I think you should pay attention to, because how this plays out will have, I think, significant implications for everyone thinking about this transformation of culture as a competitive advantage. Because the most cogent criticisms that are leveled at Zappos is that Tony Hsieh hires people who are very like himself, very rave culture, very youth-oriented, people who want to live in a frat house, and not those of us who are introverts and would rather open our wrists than live in that kind of environment. This book has been pressed on me by a lot of people, and I was initially anxious that they were pressing it on me because I am very obviously an introvert, but in fact it's because I've been talking about the unconferences that Ignition runs, and about the importance when you're running an unconference and facilitating an unstructured conversation between a bunch of industry experts, of gently deflecting the people who are trying to dominate the conversation and drawing out the people who are sitting back and listening. This entire book is about the value that introverts can bring to the table, about the opposite of what we think of when we think of as American business culture, about the people who sit back and think deeply and bring contrarian views. And the most amazing thing that I took away from this is the origin of the 10x engineer. We throw around the idea of 10x engineers a lot. All of the bro.com startups are advertising for Rockstar Ninja 10x engineers. It turns out that 10x engineers are a real thing. They work for large companies which afford them enough privacy. Engineers that can get into a state of flow are the ones who are 10 times more productive than their peers. It's not an inborn trait. It's created by environment. And that environment is the environment that we're talking about when we talk about this culture change. What we're trying to do is create environments where all kinds of people, introverts as well as extroverts, can be their most productive. And that idea of introversion really informed my current reading, which is Good to Great, and I realize I'm late to the party. This is a really amazing book. As everyone's told you, you should read it. The one thing I'll talk about from Good to Great is this idea of level 5 leadership. He said that all of the companies he tracked that went from good to great, in stark contrast to companion companies which started out very similarly but did not go from good to great, was that the good to great companies had level 5 leaders who were characterized by humility and dedication to the institution ahead of personal ambition. And those are actually the leaders that Susan Cain cites in her book about introverts. We think of business success as associated with the Lee Iacocca's of this world. In fact, Chrysler nosedived after Lee Iacocca left. The real business successes, now and in the future, are going to be led by leaders who enable everyone in the organization to find their métier, to find the place at which they're 10x engineers, at which they are most productive. I said there was going to be a bonus book, and because it's April Fool's Day, believe it or not, you're going to have a venture capitalist recommend to you a book written by a socialist French economist, which is extremely critical of global capital. The lesson you'll take away from wading through the 900 pages of Piketty, which I do highly recommend, it's an extraordinarily well-researched book, is that aliens are already here and walk among us and rule our society, and they're called corporations. And family money, because families are essentially corporations of blood when inherited wealth is involved. And the odds are on my side when I look out at you and assume that 99 out of 100 of you are not going to be members of the 1%. And given that you're not likely to have inherited wealth or be the CEOs of major corporations, you are in the same condition that I was in, which is that you've got your wits and your ability to work, your labor for sale to get by. And so it's not only in corporations' interests to create environments where people are incredibly productive. It's in your interests to create and to work for environments in which you can be very productive, because then you can maximize the value of the labor that you have to sell. It's not only at the company scale that our economy is changing. It's not only at the scale of GE that we're having to think about this transformation from manufacturing to knowledge work. We're all knowledge workers. Our future is going to be in knowledge work. It's in our interest to seek out teams that are going to treat us humanely, that are going to afford us the privacy and the space and the environments that we need to be at our most productive. And the other answer to how I ended up in venture capital is that my entire career I've never had a game plan beyond working for teams that I trusted and respected and that I believed would make me more productive. It's worked for me. I really hope it will work for you. I think DevOps is an incredible distillation of all of the practices that I've talked about. And I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, so we want to take the last few minutes for Q&A. I can run the mic around if anyone has questions.
Hi, my question's pretty easy. I was just wondering what that philosophy you were talking about with Zappos is.
Holacracy. It is outlined in a book I haven't read yet called Reinventing Organizations by an author whose name I cannot remember. The term is spelled Holacracy. And as you can see, you're getting a snapshot of my thinking in real time because I'm just scrambling to find out about that and how it's going to play out. I think it's going to be super interesting. Keen.io up in San Francisco is another company that's really betting the farm on having a holacracy-inspired culture. And what's really interesting about Keen is that the management all self-identify as introverts. So it's going to be a kind of contrast to Zappos. It'll be fascinating to watch.
You mentioned the hedgehog idea?
I mentioned the hedgehog idea and I didn't get back to it. Thank you very much for picking that up. It's from good to great. Jim Collins' contention is that the other quality that the good to great companies had, which their comparison companies lacked, was this hedgehog idea. You know the Greek myth, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. His contention is that good to great companies have one very simple, very deep insight into how they can outcompete. And it's the intersection of three qualities: their passion, the thing that they can be the best in the world at, and something that makes money. And when they can find the Venn diagram in which those three things intersect, they can be a good to great company. And his example is Walgreens, which let go of its restaurant business and doubled down on drugstore convenience. And so opened many, many drugstores so that you would always be a block or two away from them. And by betting incredibly heavily on that, Walgreens dramatically outcompeted drugstore.com in being people's pharmacist of choice. Again, amazing, amazing book. Well worth your time to read. I think people have a hedgehog idea as well. I think it's incumbent upon us as knowledge workers to find out the thing we're passionate about, that people will pay us for, and that we can be a deep domain expert on. And I'm still looking for mine, but trial and error. I'll get there.
Oh yeah, do you think DevOps and Agile are mutually exclusive, or can they survive independent of each other?
They can survive independent of each other. I've seen them exist one at a time in organizations. I think they're mutually reinforcing and that the combination of both is greater than the sum of its parts. I think a healthy DevOps culture enables better and faster agile iteration of software. I think.
Thanks, Rachel. Any other questions? Anything you want to add, Rachel?
No, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you enjoy the rest of ChefConf.
All right, let's give a hand to Rachel. Thanks.